So now that we've taken a look at the entire movie, now we're going to look at what does the entire movie as a whole have to say. To make full sense of what the film has to say, let's first take a look at what inspired this movie to begin with. Firstly, I just want to briefly go over the inspirations from Alice in Wonderland. Alice in Wonderland was a surreal children's adventure story by Lewis Carroll. Observing the story closely, we can see how the two stories parallel. Both stories feature young, curious girls going on adventures with bizarre characters. Both stories feature the young girl going through all kinds of bizarre situations with said bizarre characters. Both have implementations about consuming, except the consuming elements are entirely different in Spirited Away for reasons we're going to mention later. Visually and thematically speaking, there are lots of comparisons to be made. A talking doorknob, a large bitter woman who rules this world that the young girl is exploring. The young girl meets a bitter woman who rules a certain area, which the bizarre characters inhabit. Said bitter ruler also has a sister. The young girl frequently comes across a disappearing creature. Both stories feature characters who smoke. Who are you? Who am I? I am the daughter of the... wrong movie. Who am I? Too false... wrong movie. And speaking of which, both stories also feature a point where the young girl has to question who they are. Mainly because through their adventures, the young girls, Chihiro and Alice, forget who they previously were. They begin to lose themselves. Even miss home. I could go on and on and on about the references to Alice in Wonderland, but the main point I want to address here are the key aspects that influence this story the most. And I wanted to focus whilst our attention was still focused on identity. Because as we all know, identity is one of the key themes of Spirited Away. Alice in Wonderland did indeed inspire Spirited Away with its bizarre imagination and the young female protagonist trying to find her place in the world. Coming of age. But in order to truly understand Spirited Away, we need to delve deeper into Hayao Miyazaki himself, the creator of this film. Hayao Miyazaki is not just a good storyteller, he is one of the masters of storytelling, and he knows this. Yet from what I know about Miyazaki, from what's been documented about him, and from documentaries, Miyazaki doesn't really come across as a man who's making stories to prove himself better than anybody else. He seems to be a rather genuine person who just wants to tell great stories. It's mainly why, throughout his movies, Miyazaki never talks down to his audience, whether they're young or old. And even though Miyazaki pretty much makes up the stories as he goes along during the process of making his films, nevertheless, he expects the absolute best outcome from whatever he's thinking up, from his staff and himself. Now, because Miyazaki demands the absolute best from his staff and himself, Miyazaki is quite the perfectionist when it comes to his movies. He essentially wants to make art films that just happen to appeal to children, not just children's movies. The process is long and tiresome, and Miyazaki has announced his retirement multiple times, yet no matter how often he wants to quit the job, or rather, no matter how much he appears to often want to quit the job, he keeps coming back because he just loves the process of creation so much. And yet, through this process of creation, he's noticed that creations can tend to be corrupted by corporative capitalism. He certainly learned that the hard way with Nausicaa the Valley of the Wind.
Seriously, you should read all about that story.
I want to touch on Miyazaki's upbringing as well, particularly his Japanese roots. Much of the roots of Miyazaki's Spirited Away stems from the animism associated with traditional Shintoism in Japan. Shintoism sees to it that humans and the environment are in harmony. Shintoism endorses that humans be in harmony with nature, and since they believe that every tree and river and every aspect of nature has their own respective spirit, and since according to Shintoism, every tree and river and piece of nature has their own designated spirit, the people who practice Shintoism believe that people ought to treat nature all the more personally, since nature is personal. That element of animism should make sense of much of Spirited Away's content, because even for the Japanese people who don't live by traditional Shintoism. Most of the people of Japan live as if everything is in some way alive, even down to the technology that they use. Even to the people in Japan who don't follow the traditions of the Shintoism religion, there is still this element among all the Japanese people that they live as if everything was alive, even down to the technology they use and even their phones. This film acts as a commentary for Japan in its past and Japan in its present, and potentially Japan in its future, which is part of the reason why this film is so timeless. It is both a celebration and a critique of the Japanese lifestyle, a celebration in its culture and the beauty and growth they are able to find, but also a critique, especially with work that's centered around capitalism. This film serves as an immense critique of capitalism that endorses overconsumption. Now, in regards to work and food, there's nothing inherently wrong with these things, but they do go wrong when they are drastically used for evil ends. You see, evil doesn't really exist by itself. Evil is the twisting of a good thing. And this film suggests that when these things are used selfishly, like with Yubaba the Witch, how she abuses her workers to have this pyramid hierarchy structure where she gets all the gold and her staff gets far less, as in far less than they should, and by endorsing the customers into a never-ending cycle of greed, they end up in a never-ending cycle of wanting more and more and more. But the more they consume, the more they want more, and they consume so much, it becomes excessive. They become excessive in how much money and food they want. That never-ending cycle for money, for greed, for gluttony, and, if you read between the lines, indulgent sex. The more you endorse in these good things gone bad to excessive lengths, you eventually begin to lose yourself. You lose who you really are, who you were meant to be. And the identity crisis that lies at the core of this never-ending cycle of greed is the heart of the message of Spirited Away. If we engage in this overly corporate, over-consuming type of capitalism, we get so caught up in trying to exalt and please ourselves, we become selfish in focusing on our own pleasure rather than the pleasure of everybody else's. Notice how many, if not all, the good acts done in this film are done so through selflessness, not selfishness. Selflessness involves removing your own needs to help others. Chihiro could have easily have put her needs first and gotten on with the task of rescuing her parents sooner. But in befriending much of the residents and people in the bathhouse area, she manages to solve many problems through her growing sense of selflessness. She makes a huge contribution in cleansing the river spirit. She kindly lends her vomiting agent medicine ball that she got from said river spirit to give to No-Face to save him from his own overconsumption problem. She goes out of her way to help Haku. But Chihiro is not the only one who shows selfless ideals. After all, Chihiro started off as a selfish brat herself. If it wasn't for the helpfulness of Haku, she wouldn't have gotten started with trying to work hard in the first place. The servant Lin was hesitant to have Chihiro as her helper at first, but over time she grew a friendship with Chihiro and helped her out in the bathhouse. Kamaji, the boiler man, didn't need Chihiro for the boiler work, and Kamaji himself may have seemed a bit cranky at first. But after seeing Chihiro's newfound dedication, Kamaji helped her too. The river spirit is also quite generous in the fact that he provides a medicine ball to help Chihiro in her journey. The river spirit is also helpful in the fact that he provides a medicine ball as a reward. All throughout the film, we see accurate representations on how selfishness destroys one's character, while selflessness not only enriches one's character, but also enriches the lives of others around. Throughout this film, we see frequent accurate examples of how selfishness can destroy one's character, and how selflessness can not only build one's character, but also serve to help other people's character. Selfishness is showcased through the exaggerated showcases of greed. The critique of capitalism started off with something as basic as showing Chihiro lying back, surrounded by consumerism goods. We then see it in the way Chihiro's parents eat all the food. Confident in their privileges of riches, but ultimately indulging so much in this consumerism type of food that they lose their identities. They forget who they are because they're so fixated on their own pleasures for food. They want more food, more food, more food. But it's never enough, so they want more. And they ultimately forget who they are, and they forget that they have a daughter. This is imaginatively symbolized when Chihiro's parents transform into pigs, because pigs are creatures that are often associated with excessive gluttony and filth. They eat from the swine, they play around in mud. Next, we see it in Yubaba herself. Chihiro explores the bathhouse from the bottom up. Well, kind of the middle, going across the bridge, but ultimately having to go downstairs to the boiler room, then working her way up. Here she sees the pyramid hierarchy, starting off with the nitty-gritty of the boiler room, the comfortableness of the baths, and the basic premises for the staff to sleep around. And then she gets to the top floor with gorgeously painted vases and excessive decorations all throughout the top floor. At least I think it's the top floor. And Yubaba has excessive jewelry and rooms which I'm pretty sure just exist to be glamorous. Just collections of vases. And she's clearly not sharing her riches with anybody. Whenever she's not bossing her workers around, she's counting up her money like Scrooge from the start of A Christmas Carol. And she brings that indulgence to her baby. This kind of toxic upbringing results in a self-indulgent lifestyle for the baby in which they never get the chance to grow as a person. Yubaba thinks that by giving constant gifts to her baby, she's in a sense loving him? But in reality, she's just straight up spoiling him. There are even several presents throughout the room that are barely even opened yet. It's not that Yubaba doesn't care for her baby. As a matter of fact, her relationship with her baby is the one thing that makes her resemble some element of being human. Some element of virtuous selflessness. The type of selflessness that Chihiro eventually endorses, but Yubaba fails to embrace. And because Yubaba fails to embrace selflessness, she gets so caught up in her own selfishness that she loses a part of her identity. She eventually loses her baby. And we get a visually symbolic reminder that all her pursuits of greed were for nothing, with the fact that all the gold that No Face conjured up was actually just dirt. If we embrace the selfish pursuit of capitalism, we lose ourselves. We lose our identity. We lose our memories. We lose our relations with our loved ones. Even Freddie Mercury said something about feeling utterly lonely from the success that he found. So that goes to show that commercial success should not be the meaning of life. If we make that sort of overindulgent capitalism our meaning for life, it will result in a never-ending cycle of boosting our egos, appealing to emotions, and having a never-ending hunger for something to consume. So perhaps you should not indulge for yourself, but perhaps you should start giving what you have to others. Giving to others makes you have company and gives you the very virtues and things that you're seeking after in the first place. But if you indulge in this kind of overindulgent capitalism, you eventually become lonely, even lonelier than the loneliness you may have felt before. Again, even Freddie Mercury said this. Success has made him feel utterly lonely and made him miss out on the one thing we should all be pursuing: a personal relationship. Just thinking about it, I think linking Freddie Mercury with No Face is actually symbolically appropriate. Because no matter how much No Face tried to indulge to fill in that spiritual gap of loneliness, he still felt lonely. As a matter of fact, this overindulgence made him feel lonelier than he was before. Trying to physically fill in that spiritual gap of loneliness does not solve the problem of loneliness. It makes it worse. Robin Williams once said that the worst thing in the world is not to be lonely, but to be with people who make you feel alone. I should remind you, No Face is the type of spiritual creature who becomes what he consumes. And not just in a quirky Kirby suck power and use power kind of way, but also in his characteristics. No-Face starts off neutral and without a voice. Only a faint No-Face is lonely and sad and wants a voice, so he lures the frog and swallows the frog so that he can use his voice. Lend me your voice! Yet by embracing the frog's voice, he also embraces the frog's selfish characteristics. And the more he appetizes the selfish sense of self-indulgence, especially after Chihiro rejects his offer for gold, the more monstrous he becomes. So if greed does nothing to solve our problems and only makes things excessively worse, how do we solve these problems? We solve these problems by remembering who you are. We solve these problems by removing all that excessive consumption, finding genuine innate spiritual growth and peace, and remembering who you are. And remembering who you are is part of the timeless beauty of this movie. Zeniba said in this movie, "You never really forget something once it's happened. It just takes a while to remember it again." Paraphrasing. So, how do we eventually embrace who we are meant to be? We start by getting rid of all those things that are ruining our character. Remove the overconsumption. Vomit it out if we must. That's what managed to cure Haku and No-Face. Haku, No-Face, and a majority of other characters are all trying to fulfill their identity by various means. Perhaps it's boosting their ego for attention. Perhaps it's trying to find certain things or trying to consume certain things. With characters like Haku, perhaps they're trying to climb that pyramid of power hierarchy, symbolized by how Haku stole Zeniba's golden seal in his pursuit for power. And these problems conjured up ever since he lost his identity with no memory and no way home. So how does Chihiro help Haku after he helped her? Firstly, she removes the center of overindulgence. He gets Haku to vomit out the golden seal. Then she travels to Zeniba to apologize on his part. Zeniba then tells Chihiro something important. What I said earlier about once you experience something, you never really forget it. It just takes a while to remember it. This gives Chihiro the encouragement, I think, to help Haku find his own memory, his own identity. What also helped Chihiro come to this revelation was another act of kindness that Haku did earlier. Haku provided Chihiro her clothes and the little gift tag from her friends, which has her name on it. Seeing her name on that gift tag and seeing her clothes made her remember her identity, what her name is, who she was, her name which was stolen from her by Yubaba, reducing her name to a number or any other type of meaning for people who are knowledgeable on Japanese synoptics. Yubaba controls people by ridding them of their names, reducing them to objects to be used for her own ends. That's what greed does, and Yubaba is manipulating that greed to her own ends in her own pursuit for power, which again backfires when she loses her own baby. So she's willing to treat her baby with the respect as if the baby was an actual person to an extent, but doesn't bring that same love to her workers and anyone else. Talk about double standards. I don't think she even returns the same sentiments to her own sister. Not that her sister would help her in her greed-fueled agenda. Yubaba lives at the tip-top of this never-ending cycle of greed, mainly of her making, in direct comparison to her sister, who lives in more humble grounds, surrounded by the beauty of nature. Zeniba, by direct comparison, lives in a small cottage with a farm surrounded by the beauty of nature. And having Zeniba surrounded by nature could further implement the themes of Shintoism, that greed is the source of evil and being in touch with nature is the source of good. So, greed degenerates one's character, but selflessness increases one's character. At the center of the pursuit of greed only lies loneliness, a never-ending hunger, and the loss of who we were meant to be. So why rebel against who you were meant to be when you can be who you were meant to be? You were meant to be someone with an intimate relationship. From the perspective of a born-again Christian, this could mean finally finding that intimate relationship with the one God who created you, and then willingly beginning to grow as a person for the better. Or perhaps, to be more traditional with Japan, it could be from the Buddhist's perspective, of letting go of all worldly desires to reach that state of nirvana. Seeing how this film mainly centers around the traditional Japanese religion of Shintoism, it's probably thematically appropriate to say, from the perspective of Shintoism, it could be all about finding that innate relationship with nature and with the spiritual that lies therein. Letting go of the evils of greed to embrace the beauty of who you were meant to be. This beauty comes around when Chihiro, various times when people remember who they were meant to be. It starts off with Haku reminding Chihiro who she was to begin with, and then giving Chihiro some hints about his own past, not that he remembers much. Chihiro then returns the favor by helping Haku remind him who he is. And even though this victory of celebrating memory and identity is made bittersweet by the fact that Haku can't return home, there is another kind of victory to be had. The never-ending cycle of greed no longer affects Haku, and he now has the freedom to reject Yubaba's apprenticeship and pursue a new life. This in turn correlates with Chihiro's situation. She got so attached to her sense of greed from her past that she lost who she was, but by embracing this big journey which got her to grow as a person, she is also now ready to pursue a new life. But that doesn't mean she gets to reject the past entirely. I mean, if it wasn't for the past, she wouldn't be in the present now. By erasing the past, Chihiro would likely be doomed to repeat the same mistakes. And the people around Chihiro going forward may be too consumed by their pursuit of overconsumption to care about what Chihiro went through. Perhaps they'll never believe the story she has to tell, if she is willing to tell it, that is. What will her new life entail? Who knows? All we know is that several days have certainly gone by in the human world, judging by how grass actually grew and dust got in the car. So maybe they're gonna have to get that house they just bought back again. But it's not about finding property to possess. It's about growing as a person in pursuit of what life is really all about. The growth of character. Many people say that happiness is the meaning of life, but even evil acts like stealing a bank can make you happy for the sake of convenient money. But growing as a person, however, changes you from the inside out and gets you to focus not on your selfish pleasure, but on what's best for yourself and others. Chihiro has somehow learned this in her journey. I could go on and on and on all day about the thematic meaning of Spirited Away, because honestly, this is one of those movies where I learn something new each time I watch it. And one of my favorite things to do in my spare time is to show this film to my friends for the first time. I remember one friend remarking that this film is very well written when he saw it for the first time. I remember having a friend who thought, kind of weird. I remember introducing this to a friend, and he was pretty much enlightened to look into the other films of Studio Ghibli. Speaking of the other films of Studio Ghibli, I suppose there are a few other parallels to Miyazaki's other films, like how Chihiro's parents were cursed to turn into pigs, like Porco Rosso in Porco Rosso. Or the way the radish spirit looks down at Chihiro as this supernatural spirit next to a little girl. That could be a callback to My Neighbor Totoro. That scene with Chihiro sitting with No Face on the train. That could also harken back to My Neighbor Totoro. with Totoro and the little girls waiting for the bus. Perhaps there could be certain elements about the critiques of greed that could also harken back to the critiques of hatred in Princess Mononoke. In fact, throughout Spirited Away, if you're paying attention, there's even similar characters who have appeared in similar movies. If you're paying attention, you'll notice that there are some characters who have appeared already in some of Miyazaki's previous works, like the Suit Spirits, who have already appeared in My Neighbor Totoro. In all of Miyazaki's movies, there seems to be some messages that seem to universally relate to everybody, and these themes are done right, such as supporting the environment, showcasing the virtues of women, heavily critiquing greed and war, soaring into flight for freedom, and taking long moments to pause and to think and to reflect. All these elements appear in all of Miyazaki's movies. So what makes this movie so special to be regarded as Miyazaki's best film? After all, Miyazaki was pretty much just winging it with the plot. And Miyazaki even admitted that the story just writes itself in a way, and he just has to go along with it. Perhaps in that regard, this is probably a story that Miyazaki felt he had to display to Japan and to the world. The film contains these timeless themes, which correlate with Japan's past, were relevant at the current present in which the film was released around, and, as it turns out, 2 decades later, it's still relevant to this day. That's the true beauty of timeless messages. They will always be relevant. I had a friend of mine who taught me that to achieve timeless beauty is quite a discipline indeed, paraphrasing. When artists reach that eternal state of timeless beauty, then you can properly be called a master of storytelling. And all this celebration of memory is fully wrapped up with a song that plays in the end credits that even Hayao Miyazaki is very fond of. Always With Me. Oh yeah, that's something else I forgot to mention. The music. Well, for the most part. The music is also fantastic in this film. I could go on about how the dreamy music builds the atmosphere of this film, but there are musicians and music experts who are much more qualified than I am to study Joe's music that contributes so heavily to Hayao Miyazaki's films. And so, Miyazaki closes off Spirited Away with a tune that he himself is very fond of. Always With Me.